The best any Israeli government was ever willing to do, the best any Israeli government was ever willing to give the Palestinians, included Israel's famous 3 no's. No to negotiating on the Jordan River Valley. No to negotiating on the expanded boundaries of East Jerusalem. No to negotiating over the major settlement blocks in the West Bank. These 3 no's mean no to a Palestinian state, because these 3 combined make up most of the West Bank. Israel made it absolutely clear it would never allow the Palestinians a state in the West Bank. And when Arafat refused to sign an agreement that agreed to that, he was vilified. And that's what happened in Camp David, and that's why it all fell apart. But to blame the Palestinians for not willing to make concessions is, again, one of those absurd notions, and you wonder how the Israelis were able to sell this. When you look at the map, it's striking. It looks right at you. It's an absolutely, besides being untrue, it's absurd. Now, the problem with this issue is, of course, that they're always victims, and the victims are always innocent. In September of 1997, my sister's little girl, Smadar, was killed in a suicide attack. This is her. She was 13 years old. Now, I was living in the U.S. at the time, and when something like this happens, it's a kind of a shock that you can't express in words. You don't even know what to think. My father had already passed away 2 years before that. When I heard about this, of course, I got on the first plane and went to Jerusalem. And my sister's apartment was filled with reporters, because this was the granddaughter of, number 1, a famous general, and number 2, she was also the granddaughter of Mr. Peace with Palestine. Miko Peled being the trademark for Peace with Palestine. And now look what they did to him. So this was big news. And after the funeral, when my sister finally came out and to see everyone, she was asked the usual questions, who's responsible, and retaliation, and revenge, and so on and so forth. And the first thing that came out of her mouth was this. She said, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. Don't talk to me about killing more people. The notion that kill more people because somebody was killed is absolutely absurd. No real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. And as for who is responsible, she said, well, these 2 young men who blew themselves up were brought to such a level of despair and hopelessness that they took away their own lives and the lives of other innocent civilians, including my daughter. They were brought to this level of hopelessness and despair because of the brutal occupation that we, the Israelis, have placed upon them. Because when you take away people's homes, take away their land, destroy their houses, throw their fathers in jail for indefinite periods of time, shoot their young brothers and sisters in their schools, take away their water, take away their ability to travel, you get hopeless people, and this is what happens. She said, I hold the Israeli government directly responsible for the death of my daughter. Because this is what happens when a government does this to people. So here was an bereaved Israeli mother who had just lost her daughter, turning everything we know upside down. Because what do we know to be true? We know that the Palestinians are terrorists and the Israelis are victims. That the Palestinians won't make concessions, the Israelis want peace. Yet she's telling a completely different story. So this was, of course, bigger news. And she and her husband became activists, and they've been speaking ever since about the need to end the violence and so forth, and it's about reconciliation. Now, when I came back to the United States, on the one hand, how do you go back to work? How do you go back to life? How do you pretend that nothing happened? It's absurd. On the other hand, how do you not? You have to go back to life. And I was very fortunate that in San Diego, I met with a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group. And I began attending the meetings. And it was an excellent way for me to start learning about this issue and to get involved. I felt I had to do something. But this was the first time in my life that I actually met Palestinians. I was born and raised in Jerusalem, a mixed city. But it's a completely segregated city. It's a completely racist city. There's no way for Israeli kids to meet Palestinian kids. So the very first time I met Palestinians, I was almost 40 years old. I was living in the United States. And not only was it the first time I met Palestinians, it was the first time that I saw Palestinians who were equal to me. In other words, we were completely equal under the law. They did not need a permit to be there. They did not have to go through a checkpoint to get there. And there was no curfew that they had to meet, which meant they would have to leave. We came when we wanted. We did what we did. We left when we wanted to go. And we were completely equal. This does not exist over there. This is an experience that's very unique. And for many Israelis who would come to these meetings, it blew them away. They couldn't stay. They'd never met. They've never been in an environment where Palestinians were equal to them. And then I began learning about, the dialogue is something, you don't accuse each other, you're not arguing, everybody tells their story. And so that was the first time that I began hearing stories about the Nakba, the catastrophe. Stories about expulsion, stories about massacres. We, the Israelis, we don't conduct massacres, we don't force people into exile. We've never done things like that. We were not perfect, there were incidents here and there, but we don't do that. And the process of going from that to realizing this is true is a very long and very painful process. And my good fortune was that the Palestinian community that was there was very gracious and generous and really led me very slowly and lovingly, I should say, throughout this very painful process. It's worse than having root canal without anesthesia. It is physically painful. And I remember one particular moment where we were talking about 1948, and I sat there and I was looking at these Palestinians and I thought, this can't be true. What they're saying is diametrically opposed to what I know, and I know because my father fought there, my mother lived through it. So I went home that day and I called my older brother who teaches political science at Tel Aviv University. And I said, look, I'm sitting here with these Palestinians and they're saying these things. Does any of it have any merit? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, yes. And this was just after, or shortly after, Ilan Pappé and several other Israeli historians had rewritten the history of what happened in 1948. Now, because these were Israeli historians, we could accept it. Palestinians have been saying the same thing for decades, but that was unacceptable because they're biased and they're lying. So, of course, I began reading Ilan Pappé and all the other books. They were out there and getting engaged and learning about this as much as I could. And then when I would visit Israel, I would go into Palestinian communities, and I developed some friendships there, and then I would go into the West Bank. And it's a very interesting process. If you've been to the West Bank, or if you've crossed from Israel proper into the West Bank, besides the massive wall that's out there today, you may have seen this warning sign. This particular one is at the Kalandia checkpoint on the way to Ramallah from Jerusalem. But what the sign says is that this road upon which you are traveling leads to Area A, which is under Palestinian control. And it is forbidden for Israelis to enter Area A. It is life-threatening, and it's a felony. And it ends, as you can see, not with one, but 2 exclamation marks. In other words, if the threat of death didn't scare you enough, the 2 exclamation marks will surely capture your attention. Now, what do you do when you see a sign like this? I mean, how do you not run back? I mean, how do you not run home? Turn around and go the other way. Luckily, I didn't have that kind of sense, and I didn't go back. And I still haven't, and many others that I know haven't. And what happens is every time I cross, I see the exact same thing. And this happened even this time as well as I went to Gaza. Not only did I see the signs, I had to go under the ground to get there, breaking about 52 different laws, on the way. The first sight you see when you enter Palestinian cities, or the most common sight, is children going to school. Because they typically have 2 shifts of school. So you always see kids in their uniforms and backpacks going to school or coming home from school. And then you see traffic jams, and you see, people going to work, and you see markets, and you see stores, and so on and so forth. I've yet to see the threat. I've been doing this for more than 10 years. I've yet to see the threat. Where is the threat? Because this said it's life-threatening. Where's the threat? I haven't seen anybody that's ready to kill me, or that cares that I'm there enough to even try. I mean, I've not seen that. Palestinians don't have a military force. They're not walking around with guns. I mean, I've never seen it. Nobody cares. I mean, even in Gaza, full of Hamas people, the new monstrosity, of course, Where's the threat? And what I've come to realize is that this sign and the massive wall that's been built, throughout the West Bank and around Gaza, and the massive military force that Israel has, guarding all these places, and the terrorizing of Palestinians when they go through checkpoints by Israel, and the terrorizing of Palestinians when they go through Tel Aviv airport, if they choose to fly for some reason, God forbid, hours and hours of interrogation, humiliation, and really terrorizing. None of this has anything to do with anybody's security. None of it has anything to do with safety or security. It's all an attempt to keep one side always afraid and one side always frustrated. It's an attempt to keep people apart. It's an attempt to make sure that there will never be peace. For the attacks on Gaza, something that Israel has done over the last 65 years periodically. None of these attacks have anything to do with safety. It used to be because they were infiltrators. Then they were because there was something else. Now because of Hamas. But if you look at the history consistently, on a regular basis, Israel attacks Gaza because if it doesn't attack, the only other option is to make peace. Oh, that's not an option we want to go. That's not somewhere we want to go. So you have to create fear, you have to create war, you have to create tension, because otherwise you have to move towards peace. And that is not something that Israel will ever want to do. Now, I end the book with a discussion about the solution. And I'll end my remarks tonight as well. The reality is that Israel integrated the West Bank into Israel. Israel created one Jewish state over all of Palestine. It is one state. It's done. There's no room for partition. There's no room. You can't delineate a part for Jews, a part for Arabs, a part for this or that. It's done. The other part of the reality, though, that you have about 6 million Palestinians and about 6.5 million Israelis living there. But it's Israel. It's only a Jewish state. It's not a state. It's not your state if you're a Palestinian. So half the population is not part of the system, is not part of the state, there's nothing there for them. Now, the way Israel does this and ends up very skillfully being considered a democracy is by having different laws to govern different parts of the population, which is why it's often called an apartheid system. You have the laws that govern people like myself, Israeli Jews. It's a democracy. I can say what I please, I can go where I please, I can come and go through the boundaries anywhere I go. It's my country. I've got the VIP pass. I've got an Israeli passport. And I'm an Israeli Jew. You've got the laws that govern the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, which Israel likes to call the Arabs of Israel. There are about 30 laws in the law books that discriminate specifically against them. There are no equal rights. You'd be hard-pressed to find a single dollar ever invested or a single permit ever given to Palestinian communities within Israel to build anything, a home, a school, a road, over 65 years. They're some of the most neglected communities you will ever find are Palestinian communities within Israel, in some places worse than in Gaza. Israeli police, for example, will not come in and take care of crime, as one example. And the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens live in an environment of racism and segregation. A Palestinian couple who are Israeli citizens, for example, could never get a mortgage. Why? There's no law that says it, but they can never get a mortgage because nobody will give them a mortgage. Things like that, besides the laws. And then you have the laws that govern the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza, and there are no laws that protect them. It is the law of the Israeli military, which is really nothing more than a glorified terrorist organization. The Israeli military, it's true, they have commanders in uniforms, and they're very well armed and very well financed, but they are nothing more than a glorified terrorist organization because they engage in terror. They engage in terrorizing an entire nation. Palestinians can be arrested, can be beaten, their homes can be destroyed, you can drop bombs from the air and kill their children any day, any time, with no accountability. No one will ever get in trouble. This is the law of the land. And by keeping these three different sets of laws for the different sets of the population is how Israel maintains this absurd, the sense that somehow it is a democracy where in fact it's a brutal regime. It's a brutal racist regime. So where do we go from here? Partition is not an option. Anybody that still talks about the possibility of a Palestinian state or a two-state solution, is delusional. And is complete misreading of the reality, complete misreading of the situation on the ground. But you still have two people sharing the same land, sharing the same country. The only solution, other than leaving things the way they are, the only other solution would be a transformation of this Jewish state into a democracy. A democracy. Equal rights for everyone. Not a Jewish state, not an Arab state, not a Christian state, a state of its citizens. A state where everybody votes, a state where everybody has the same laws and the same rights. And the sooner this is done, the better and the easier it's going to be. Now, I would argue that not only is it morally right, and not only is it the just thing to do, but it's also inevitable. You have two communities that are very similar. Israeli and Palestinian societies are very similar. Most Israelis are actually descendants of Arabs because they are the descendants of Jewish immigrants who are Arab Jews who came from Iraq and North Africa and Yemen and so forth. Most Israelis are descendants of Arab Jews. So if they don't speak Arabic, their parents and grandparents speak Arabic. And they listen to Arabic music and they eat Arabic food and they have Arabic culture in their home. They're Arabs. Of course, they're not called that because you can't say Arab Jew. Arab is a bad word, so they're called Sephardic, as though they all came from Spain, which means they're European, so it's okay. You can't say Arab Jew because Arab is a dirty thing. Or Orientals, they're called Oriental Jews, as though they came from China or something. You know, anything but calling them Arabs, which is what they are. But more than half or the majority of Israelis are really Arabs, the descendants of Arabs, as hard as it is for some of them to realize this. Education levels are very similar. Socioeconomically, they're very similar. Of course, Israelis have a lot more opportunities than Palestinians, but it's not to a point where the two can't merge. There are areas where the societies have already merged. I'll give you a couple of examples. One, for example, doctors. If you go to Israeli hospitals, you see Palestinian doctors everywhere. I have a cousin who is a head of surgery at Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. He said to me when we were talking about this, he said, my best surgeons, he said, are Palestinians trained in Amman, Jordan. At least half the nurses are Palestinians, also, by the way, trained in Amman, Jordan. So the two societies are already merging, but these same doctors, and my mother is 86, she had surgery about 6 months ago. The anesthesiologist was a Palestinian, and the surgeon was a Palestinian, both graduates of Harvard Medical School. They came back to Palestine, they work in an Israeli hospital. But when they go through Israeli airport, they are treated like criminals. They are strip searched and they're held for hours before they're allowed to go on the plane, and then they're handheld by a 22-year-old security guard and led to their seat. Because once they're sterilized, which is the word they use, once they've been checked, they can't mingle anymore. They can't shop, they can't have a cup of coffee at the airport. And these are they're treating my mother. So this is exactly the absurdity. This is why it's inevitable. And there are other areas, policemen. There are areas, even in Israeli cities in the West Bank, you see, in the hospitals, you see Palestinians and nurses and so on and so forth, because there are areas where it's inevitable. So there's no question that this is a process that's already taking place. Now, besides this, there's already a resistance movement that's fighting for this. People think of Palestinian resistance as terrorism. But the reality is that the vast majority of Palestinian resistance has always been nonviolent. I'll give you several examples. If you look at Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, thousands and thousands of them. Thousands and thousands of prisoners in Israeli jails, okay? A very small percentage, less than 10%, were charged with violence. The vast majority are political prisoners. Many of them were not charged with anything at all. They're under administrative, administrative arrest, detention, yes. If you look at the process that's been taking place over the last 5, 6, 7 years here in North America, 5, 6, 7 years ago on campuses, a new group came out called Students for Justice in Palestine, mostly in the University of California. Last year, there were over 120 universities and colleges where SJP held major events. They hold Israeli Apartheid Week, they hold Palestine Awareness Week, they bring speakers, they build a wall in the middle of campus, they have checkpoints, they do tremendous work. They went from 7 or 8 campuses to over 120 in less than 5 years. This year there's going to be more. I have so many invitations to speak at them, and so do other speakers, more than I could possibly do. Last year I spoke in 4 colleges here in Canada. So this is a growing movement in campuses that's changing the way people look at Palestine and changing the way people view the issue of Palestine. There's a major shift. There's also a major shift. There's also a movement called the BDS, which is the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. This is an organization, it's a movement that's led by very principled people. I know many Israelis and Jews who participate, and they're calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions to be imposed upon Israel. And they're gaining more and more victories. More and more companies won't do business with Israel. More and more artists and performers won't perform for Israel. Only last December, Stevie Wonder was supposed to perform at a big fundraiser for the Israeli army. He pulled out. And then more and more trade unions and so forth and student organizations are demanding to divest from Israel, from companies that do business with Israel. So this is another movement that's growing. And it's been growing in leaps and bounds. And it's hurting Israel. And it's hurting this apartheid state. And then you've got a very persistent, very dedicated, and very principled popular resistance, popular protest that takes place in the West Bank every single week. Every Friday, every Saturday, about a dozen different places, there are protests. And they're met by massive violence. I go there and participate. Other Israelis go and participate with Palestinians whenever I can. In 2005, this began with one small village who decided to do this. Year after year after year, it's growing and growing and growing. Either Friday after prayers or Saturday, there's a protest, there's a march. Non-violent, met by massive amounts of violence by the Israeli army. Now, these leaders, these Palestinian leaders who lead all of these, will never give up. They will not stop until it's over. And the Israeli military met about 6-7 months ago to discuss this issue and see what kind of response does the military have for this new form of resistance. And they came out and they said they have no answer. There is no military answer for this. So this is a process that's already taking place in many, many different aspects, in many different levels. And I would argue that anybody who cares about this issue, anybody who cares about peace and justice, anybody who wants to see peace for Israelis and Palestinians, has to work towards a transformation, a transition from this racist state, which is the state of Israel, into a real democracy. And not to be afraid to say that it has to be the end of the Jewish state. The Jewish state, by the way, does not represent Jews. Most Jews have never been there. Most Jews will never go there. Most Jews never supported Zionism to begin with. The Zionist leaders, nobody voted for them. They proclaimed themselves to represent Jews. So there's nothing anti-Semitic about criticizing Israel. There's nothing anti-Semitic about talking that Israel is a racist state that has to be transformed into democracy. There's nothing, nobody's talking about genocide or anything like that. And I think this is an important point. Now, the last point I'll make is this: the reality or the notion that the Israelis and Palestinians have to live in war is not true. There is a solution. It's a beautiful country. It's a country with a lot of potential. These are two societies that if the walls came down tomorrow, they could function perfectly well as a society, as a democracy, and move forward, and really bring forward the potential that country and these people have within them, have in store. But it has to be a democracy with equal rights. Thank you all very much.